Tomorrow, if you're interested in CICD and how Git works with Visual Studio Code, we have the awesome Matthias Tierbach, who is taking me through branching out. It's our little spin-off podcast where Matthias, who's a professional developer of immense skill, is having to deal with Sue, who is not not a professional developer. But so we're talking business and we're talking DevOps and how it all works together. So it's lots of fun. So I'm going to hand over to you, Kevin. Any questions? Anthony is here in the chat and Jake is here in the chat, so please pop them in because we do like to keep it as interactive as possible. So thank you, Kevin.
You're welcome. Can everybody see my screen okay? Just a reaction from somebody would be great. Yep.
Yeah.
So obviously welcome everybody to today's session. As you can see in the little star, it has a little tiny bit of AI content and it's usable AI content. So everybody's in luck. So agenda very quickly, obligatory bio, introduction to Fabric, introduction to Azure DevOps, configuring Azure repos for Git integration, using DevOps and AI for CI/CD workflow options, and then finally CI/CD in data warehouses and SQL database in Fabric. Because I've got a lot of content today, I will very quickly go through my bio. My name's Kevin Chant. I'm a lead technology advocate living in the Netherlands, but as Sue kind of spoiled earlier, for those who were in the meeting at the beginning, I'm actually originally from the southwest of the UK. Worked in IT for quite some time, data platform MVP, MCT, etc., etc. And you can find me in a few different places online. So, with that being said, let's dive straight into the session and do a quick overview of Microsoft Fabric using an updated diagram. I would say brand new for 2026, brand new for the end of 2025. So this is Microsoft Fabric architecture diagram. You may have seen similar ones before. In the top right hand corner, you have the 4 principles that Microsoft Fabric is built on, including AI powered, because as you probably know, it's a lot of AI infused things happening in Microsoft Fabric now. Interesting times. Lots of items have co-pilot experiences as data agents, etc., etc. Anyway, I will very quickly go through the different workloads with my nice shiny new workload diagram for you all. So Power BI, same as Power BI you may have used before, only not because there's lots of innovations and optimizations, including the direct lake storage mode. Databases, and this is where you can work with transactional databases directly in Microsoft Fabric, which currently includes SQL database in Fabric and Cosmos DB. Data Factory is where you orchestrate your data movements in Fabric. Hey, Jake's stolen one of the, I've seen that question before, Jake, in another session. I've seen you use that in the past.
That was my question before, yeah.
Ah, somebody else used that question before then. I can answer that in a bit, and actually we'll talk a bit about GitHub if you really want to in a second. Anyway, Data Factory, orchestrate data movement using either data pipelines, data flows Gen 2, or you can actually use notebooks and a bit of Airflow. Industry Solutions is where you can download an entire collection of Fabric items as like a template to be able to deliver certain industry solutions. Also includes some good templates for sustainability. So any of you in the UK who's got to deliver reports for CSRD for the EU, basically you can look to use one of these industry solutions. IQ, which is where you can work with some interesting new offerings in Microsoft Fabric, including Fabric IQ, which includes something nice, shiny and new called ontologies that you might want to look at online. Then we have real-time intelligence, formerly known as real-time analytics, with a new name and a slight logo change, because those of you who may remember when Fabric first came out, it introduced something called Data Activator. That's now part of real-time intelligence. hence why it's nice and red. Apart from that, real-time intelligence deals with all your real-time data requirements, basically. Data engineering, and this is where you can work the lakehouse paradigm at scale. With Microsoft Fabric, you get a nice lakehouse editor with it. You get to work with notebooks. It's all backed by Spark Compute, mostly backed by Spark Compute, because now you can just run generic Python notebooks, etc. Data science, I quite like this. This is where your data scientists can work together inside an actual Fabric workspace and share machine learning models and experiments. Data warehouse, and this is where you can use T-SQL to work with large amounts of data at scale. And then finally, custom workloads, and these are workloads typically created by partners. You may have heard a bit of buzz about the Fabric Extensibility Toolkit. One link I forgot to put in the chat to share with you all today is relating to that. Maybe one of the moderators will be able to find that for me. There is currently a competition, by the way, for people. Prize is a ticket to FabCon in Atlanta. Whoever comes up with the best concept with the Fabric Extensibility framework. Some of you may be interested in. Now, there's typically two groups of services I recommend working with if you're going to work with Fabric in the enterprise. One is Purview for your compliance and governance requirements. And the other one is Azure DevOps for GitHub for your CICD and automation requirements. Now, there was a question in the chat earlier, or more of a rhetorical question, I think, about why you prefer Azure DevOps or GitHub, and why is it GitHub? Here's the interesting thing, though. If you want to use GitHub with some of the elements I showed today, you need to have create a personal access token. It doesn't actually support GitHub authentication. Another important point I should highlight here is that GitHub Enterprise Server, the one you install on your own servers, is not currently supported by the offerings you see today either, to an extent. Something to bear in mind. So even if you prefer GitHub, there are a few, as some people would see as limitations, but just things to consider. More than welcome to ask more questions about GitHub in the chat. Even though this is an Azure DevOps session, I'm quite flexible because I've worked with both. Right, so I will very, very quickly do a Fabric walkthrough for you all now. This is essentially how Fabric looks when you go into it. And you can basically, and the main reason I cover all the Fabric items is because you can perform CICD for the majority of items that you deploy into a workspace. More about that shortly. And somebody's asked about Purview pricing. I'm afraid I haven't got a master's degree. I'm only joking. Purview pricing is a topic that we discussed out of this session, Chris, and definitely not one for an Azure DevOps session, if that's okay. So I very quickly showed you how Fabric looks. Actually, I'll go back into it a moment just to give you all. So here is that. That's why I want to go through Fabric quickly to highlight all of these. You can perform CI/CD, the majority of them, in different ways from one workspace to another. So, and the free version thing, I started a trial especially for this session, by the way. I saw the question appear in the chat about it. Fume, I'm seeing lots of comments come in. I will talk about Fume actually later in this session. So Azure DevOps manages your application lifecycle management all the way from creating your initial work items for it to actually deploying the release. In reality, Azure DevOps actually contains a set of services by default, like you can see on this very nice diagram here. So it includes Azure Boards for managing work items, Azure Repos for storing your Git repositories, and Azure Pipelines for orchestrating your deployments. Now, there's two main versions of Azure DevOps: Azure DevOps Services, which is a cloud-based version, which we focus on today; Azure DevOps Server, which is the version you install on your own machines. And there is an MCP server available now for Azure DevOps. Gives you a slight hint on what I might show later in this session. So with that being said, let's go and have a look at Azure DevOps. So this is Azure DevOps. When you first go into it, I'll make this screen a bit bigger for everybody. In the top left-hand corner, you get an icon that represents both the account that you're logged into Azure DevOps with, and it also directly links to the tenant you're connected with as well. Because that has a bearing on which organizations you have access to. Now, these organizations can be one you've created yourself for testing purposes, or if you are using a work account, it could be a works organization, or if you work for a large enterprise, it could be a domain within your enterprise. If you have the right permissions, you can change various settings at the organization level. Now, strangely enough, this is a 1-hour session. I'm not going to go through all of these items. As I scroll down, you can see you've got various ones. I will highlight something relating to settings though, because some time ago now, Microsoft actually introduced the ability to disable the creation of classic pipelines. In other words, the GUI-based build and release pipelines. So if you can't see those at work, there's a very good chance that's because your Azure DevOps admin has actually enabled these options and disabled them. Anyway, each organization contains one or more projects. It's a hierarchical structure. And if I click on a project, you can see all the default services I mentioned before on the left-hand side. So you have Azure Boards, managing your work items, Azure Repos to work with your Git repositories. And if I click on Files, for example, you can see a visual representation of your Git repository in Azure DevOps. Very useful, especially for people who are not, let's say, 100% on the case with working with Git commands. Then you have Azure Pipelines, and this is where you orchestrate your pipeline deployments basically in Azure DevOps. In other words, deploying items from one place to another in the terms of Fabric. Azure Test Plans, and this is where you can create test plans centrally in Azure DevOps without having to use spreadsheets, which I quite like the idea of. And then Azure Artifacts, and this is where you can work with certain different types of packages, if you will, if you compare it to GitHub, directly in Azure DevOps. Lots of different types of packages. There is one called Universal Packages, though, which is basically where you can store any type of files. A lot of people commonly use that for things like PowerShell modules, etc. So, and just like at the organization level, if you have the relevant permissions, you can change various settings at the project level. Now, in the real world, out of the two types of settings, these are probably the ones you've got the most influence over. I'm not going to go through all of these again because it's a 60-minute session. One thing I will highlight here in particular is to do with service connections. If you do create service connections in your Azure DevOps project, the things like your Azure subscriptions, so you can deploy from pipelines to resources in Azure, make sure you give your service connections nice user-friendly names. Otherwise, you can run the risk of exposing things like your subscription IDs. So that is my very short and hopefully concise for some of you introduction walkthrough to Azure DevOps. Now I see a lot of questions appearing in the chat. So before I talk about Git integration, I will just quickly run through if that's okay, everybody. So let's go through very quickly. AI, water buckets.
Yeah, don't worry, Kevin. We chat a lot. If it was anything we wanted you, we would but there's lots of conversations going on, and people
No,
talk
it's
about
fine. It's very
the topic
chatty,
is,
people.
yeah.
If there's any questions, I will leave it for the moderators to say it in natural stoppages.
Yeah, no, we'll stop you when it's something, but we're quite lucky because there's Jake in the chat and Anthony as well. But we will definitely shout.
And I actually cover this CI test shortly, by the way, folks.
Ah, brilliant.
So about Fabric
Good.
Git integration, it allows supported items to have metadata synchronized with a Git repository, not the data in items themselves, just the metadata. To be more precise, with a branch in a Git repository, so you can create multiple branches and have them set up to connect to different workspaces. It supports the cloud-based versions of Azure DevOps and GitHub, requires a Fabric or Power BI premium capacity because obviously people still use Power BI premium capacities in the workplace, at least at this moment in time. And items are supported at various levels. So to give you some context on this, if you create a Power BI report in a workspace configured with Git integration, behind the scenes, it will create a Power BI desktop project. You create SQL database in Fabric, behind the scenes, it will create a database project. However, if you create a lakehouse, behind the scenes, it will create a container with the lakehouse name and details about any shortcuts it contains. It does not create the metadata for your Delta tables at this moment in time. So just to give you all examples of supported items, including some new ones, as you can see here, we have, for example, data agents. So if anyone's working with data agents, you can actually use those with Git integration now. Interesting times. And in case anyone was going to ask in the chat, yes, it is supported by things like Fabric CICD. And a whole host of other things. If you're working with real-time intelligence, a lot of the items there are now supported by Git integration. As you can see, it's a very deep verbose list. Now, to configure Git integration with Azure DevOps, it utilizes Entra authentication. Remember I said earlier about GitHub uses personal access tokens. Well, Azure DevOps can use Entra authentication. It can be an Entra user, or now it can be a service principal as well. So if you want to automate workspace Git integration, you can actually put in your service principal details instead, and it can connect with that instead of you having to configure it with the connectivity of a user. So the user, as I say here, it could be a service principal, requires access to both the workspace in question and the Git repository. And just to help with a common misconception here, and there's a very common question I get, unsupported items can still be deployed in the workspace. So if you do work with an item that's not yet supported by Git integration, you can still deploy it into your own workspace.
And sorry, just to clarify, and this is for premium, Fabric Premium or Power BI Premium?
For either Power BI Premium capacities or any Fabric capacity, including an F2.
Oh, really? So you can use Git integration with F2?
You can use Git integration with F2. If you're working in a team and you deploy an F2 though, you may get a few questions from your colleagues if you're using notebooks. But yes, you can do this with an F2. So if you want to do your own testing in the environment, you can use F2 indeed. It works with trial as well, as you can all see today. I sell a trial tenant, especially for this, and that can be used with it, etc.
Jake just said turn it on, comment, then turn it off.
Yeah, so some security considerations here. Keep your organization and repository in the relevant region, ideally. Keep your organization private, because the reality is, if you release your GitHub repository into the public domain, there are ways that people can detect it and it can get scraped, etc. Avoid exposing sensitive details in repositories and pipelines. So, for example, as some of you may know, now and again, engineers are prone to doing some interesting things like hard coding in Azure Data Lake Storage Account access keys into their notebooks. Try to avoid doing this. And one way to help is to consider implementing GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps. This is great because it will stop you committing secrets if it finds it amongst a list of types of secrets it knows about. However, just be aware, like all good things in the world, this does come with a cost factor. And make sure you read the small print because it does backdate up to, I think it's currently 60 days of everybody who's committed in that repository, and you'll get charged so much per person. So I will very briefly do a Git integration demo for you all now. So we go into Microsoft Fabric, and I have a blank workspace, which I've imaginatively called blank workspace. So I'll make this a bit bigger for you all, a lot bigger even. Click on workspace settings. You can select Git integration. You can then select either Azure DevOps or GitHub. You can select an account. And then once I click on connect for an account, by the way, if you only have one account set up, it's nice and easier. And then as you can see, I have this very nice intuitive drop-down menu for selecting organization, project, my Git repository, branch, and then maybe even a folder option. I've already done this. Like a popular UK series says, here's one I did earlier. So if we go to Git integration for this other workspace, you can see that it's already connected up to a repository and a branch. In fact, it's connected to a development branch. Once Git integration is enabled, you will soon know if you're working in Fabric, you'll have this nice Git status column appear. And hopefully you'll have lots of green ticks for synchronized. You'll get a source control button appear. And if you click on there, you'll see two different tabs saying changes and updates. To help with some terminology, changes are all the changes you do in your workspace. You want to be committed back to the branch in the Git repository stored in Azure DevOps. Updates is the other way around, going from your Git repository to your workspace. Tip for you all, by the way, if you're like me and you have lots of repositories and workspaces, you can click on the ellipsis in source control, select view repository, and that will take you directly to your Git repository in question. And yes, it does work for GitHub as well if you're logged in. You have some other options here. So if I click on the branch kind of icon to the right, I can actually select a feature called branch out to workspace. And also I can click on source control details. More about branching out to workspace shortly. So I want to cover now talking about using Azure DevOps with the suggested CICD workflow options, because back in September 2024, Microsoft released an article about their suggested CICD workflow options. And here I provide guidance on how Azure DevOps fits into it and actually give you a little bit of advice how you can improve on them as well. Now, are there any questions before I get started with this that I should consider?
Just mine.
Colin.
So I just said, I'm assuming Azure DevOps is the middle layer to manage projects, which is then has the source control managed by Git.
It's a very good point. If you saw that nice diagram I showed earlier when I introduced Azure DevOps, where it manages your full application lifecycle management, yes, you can do. I mean, it's interchangeable. You can use other services if you want to, but yeah. So you can create your initial work items. You can work in it with your boards, whether that's Sprint, Kanban, Scrum, and whatever in Azure boards. And you can actually directly link to your changes you do in your Git repository in Azure repos directly in those work items. So personally, I've used Azure boards quite a lot over the years, and I do recommend it. But yeah, if you're using other work item systems, you can connect as well. Anyway, can ask me more questions about this, Sue, after the session so that we can carry on with this. So here's the recommended development process by Microsoft. And what they're saying is either somebody's working locally in an IDE like Power BI Desktop, or they're working directly in the Fabric workspace that's connected to a feature branch, and then that's their own, they can be their own isolated feature branch. Ideally, it is their own isolated one, or a feature branch that a couple of colleagues are working with, or it can be a dedicated developer branch, if I'm honest. And then you can merge it with the branch that's connected to the next workspace on. And this is typically your main or dev branch. I see there's questions appearing. So what is the question before I go to next? I saw my name appear.
Yeah, so Jack's asked, he's got a workspace connected to a GitHub repository and he wants to change it using Azure DevOps. Do you have any suggestions on how to move the data he's collected so far?
Do you know if it's just a workspace and you want to keep the data in the workspace, it doesn't affect the data if you do this, folks. You can just go into Git integration, disconnect from your GitHub repository, and then connect and go for that menu which I showed you earlier to connect that to an Azure DevOps repository. That will just synchronize then the metadata again in your repository in Azure DevOps. That is one simple, easy way to do it. Hope that answers your question. There are other ways, but that's the simplest one. Just disconnect and then set it back up again.
Brilliant. And UV said he's heard that the commits are migratable, but not the PRs.
On GitHub, you can actually link. You can connect the Azure boards to your GitHub repositories instead and actually link those up. There's actually a lot of detailed documentation and Microsoft Learn documentation online about that.
Brilliant. And then a quick one from Kundan, which said any file size limit to push to the GitHub or Azure repo.
Yes, there's limits set in Azure DevOps which you can maintain and change. That's a simple, easy answer. Anthony's already putting those into the chat, I do believe.
Yes.
Anyway,
brilliant.
Back to this. And I actually recommend, going back to what people were talking about earlier, with the recommended development process, it actually introduce unit tests. So you can actually, when you make your changes, for example, locally or in Fabric, when you go to do your pull request from your feature branch to, say, your main or dev branch, you can actually have an Azure pipeline run that will do checks with Best Practices Analyzer or with PBI Inspector, etc. Doesn't have to be just Power BI reports. You can also do automated tests for things like data pipelines as well, using what is known as the Data Factory testing framework. Now, there are some links that I forgot to throw into the chat, which I will actually do for you all now, because that leads up to some of this nicely. I'll wait for the other one shortly. Data Factory testing framework I will throw in there because that's what you can use for your data pipelines. The other things I will share shortly. So there are various ways you can branch out to a new workspace. If you are working in a development workspace, like I showed just now, to branch out to a feature branch, so you can do this development process. So if we go back a couple of slides here. So for example, if you want to go to a feature workspace from a dev workspace, which is absent from this diagram apparently, you can either use the GUI that I showed you just now. You can either do it to a new workspace and a new branch in the repository or existing branch, or you can automate it in Azure pipelines as well. So there is a way you can automate branching out from a development workspace and branch to a feature workspace and branch. And the automated way actually does a lot of the rebindings for you. More on that shortly. So some branching advice. Keep your update cycles short, basically. The shorter, the better. That way you reduce the chance of getting all these merge issues that you may have seen people complaining about online. And also tidy up your branches and workspaces afterwards. So I will very quickly, because of the time constraints here, I will show you the pipeline that's been created. So if we go into Azure DevOps, I have this pipeline called branch out to new workspace. Now, this is actually based on a offering made available by Microsoft, and that's in the Fabric Toolkit. So what I will do, just bear with me if I can find the right one here. I've got a couple of links to put in the chat relating to this. So here's the script, and you can download this from Microsoft. And like I said, this script is part of the Fabric Toolbox, which you can easily find if you go to somewhere like Fabric Essentials. Fabric Essentials, by the way, folks, if you want to see a lot of GitHub, well, a lot of Git contributions made by either the community or Microsoft, this site is ideal because you can go to it and you can just browse through community contributions or well-known Microsoft GitHub repositories. So for example, here I can scroll in, I can see the Data Factory testing framework. We go to Fabric Toolbox, there's a whole load of offerings here, including the branch out to new workspace I just put in the chat. So what you can do, you can set it up and you have this very nice YAML pipeline. If I go back here, I'm just going to go into the last run. As you can see, I did run this recently, literally right before this session. I can type in run new, and in fact, let's just very quickly do this now. I'm just going to create one with a new workspace name and click on run. And what this will actually do now, I have this exact workspace. I'm going to branch out automatically and create a new branch for me behind the scenes. Like I said, I actually did create one earlier, and hopefully I do have to click refresh because it's Microsoft Fabric here. I actually did create this one earlier. As you can see, it's exactly the same items that was in my development branch. It's branched out. I go to Git integration. You can see it's actually branched out to a different branch. And here's the best thing about this automated thing. If I go to my notebook, in my notebook, in my dev workspace, it's actually connected up to the lakehouse in my dev workspace. This one, oh yeah, has actually done the rebindings for me, but actually hasn't in this particular case. So when you do this, it's supposed to do the rebindings. Let me just check I'm in the right one here. So just be aware that it is possible, and it's the same for Power BI reports, semantic models, etc. It should do the rebindings for you with that automated script.
Can I just check the rebindings are that it's rebinding it to the lakehouse in the workspace that you're sending all of your items to?
Exactly.
Okay.
Someone's mentioned Fabric CICD. This is coming up shortly. Right, recommended release options. I will be short and fast with this so we can see some really good stuff in demos, everybody, because these are all on the workflow options document, which I will very quickly put into the chat as well. All right, so first some Azure Pipelines terminology. Pipeline I've already explained about. Variables are predefined variables that you can set either in or out of the pipeline. Please define your variables out of the pipeline. Never define your variables inside them. Parameters are values, as I showed you just now, that you can enter when your workflow is started. And agents does all the work for the pipeline. So when you actually run a pipeline like I did just now, Azure DevOps doesn't magically do it for you. It actually sends it all off to what's known as an agent. And an agent you can think of as a virtual machine hosted somewhere. And it can be either one hosted by Microsoft or by yourselves. Anyway, Now the terminology is explained. Let's go straight into this. First option, Git-based deployments. And this is where you can deploy the multiple workspaces connected to the same Git repository. So the idea is that you have different branches in your Git repository, and each of those branches are connected to a different workspace. So like I showed you earlier in Git integration, I had a workspace connected to a dev branch, could have another workspace connected to a test branch, and another connected to a prod branch. Now, here's a diagram to help you visualize this. So as you can see, you've got an update that you do in your feet in a workspace, and then you just merge on to your next one on. I will show this briefly in the demo. Option 2, and this is by far the most popular one at the moment. This is Git-based deployments using a build pipeline. So basically, you do like I showed earlier, set your Git integration, have all your Fabric items exist inside a repository, and then you deploy to other workspaces using Azure pipelines. Now, one benefit of doing this is that you don't need to have Git integration configured for your target workspaces. So you only, say if you want to deploy the dev, test, and production, you'd only need to configure Git integration really for your dev workspace, and then use Azure pipelines to look at those items in the development branch and then deploy to the other workspaces. Now, Microsoft's recommendation is that each workload contains build and release process, build for unit tests, and release to perform the updates. And here is a diagram to help you visualize how this looks. So basically do the same development process I showed earlier, and then use Azure pipelines to read through some of those Fabric items that are stored in your repository and deploy those items with metadata for them to other workspaces. You have some recommendations relating to this. Consider YAML pipelines, because you can use the nice classic GUI ones, but you can't do pull requests on the classic pipelines and they're not transferable. So in other words, YAML pipelines are actually stored as files inside your repository. So if you move your repository somewhere else, you can easily connect back up. You can't do that with classic pipelines. As I mentioned earlier, avoid sensitive values in your pipeline. Either store them in variable groups or in Azure key vault. Implement approvals for your production workloads. Now I must stress, these approvals do not have to be manual ones. Yes, lots of workspaces want people to actually approve before the deployment. It's good working practice, but they can be automated as well based on things like metrics that have been discovered through Azure Monitor or from somewhere else in your environment. Going on to Fabric CICD that I keep seeing pop up in the chat. Suggest looking at tooling as a layer abstraction. You can look to use your PowerShell modules, the Fabric CI/CD Python library, and the Fabric command line interface. Now I'm just going to throw some links in the chat for things I didn't put in earlier. So links for PBI Inspector, because that's quite good for doing continuous integration tests for you, the visuals in your Power BI reports. Here are links for Fabric CI/CD. Now, one key point I want to highlight. These toolings are not mutually exclusive. You can actually use all three together to deliver powerful solutions in Azure Pipeline. For example, you can use PowerShell modules that run certain Fabric CLI commands based on certain criteria, like, for example, check that certain service connections exist. And if they don't, create them with the Fabric CLI command. Or for workspaces, do the same thing. And then once Fabric CLI is created the workspace, you can then look to implement Fabric CI/CD to deploy items into those workspaces. See a comment, many things to learn. My advice, by the way, small steps. I am keeping an eye on the chat, folks. Anyway, option 3, Fabric deployment pipelines. This is where Microsoft recommends to do the recommended development process I showed earlier, and then manage it with Fabric deployment pipelines. From there, either do it with Fabric, you can do it with Fabric deployment pipelines, but if you're like me and you have to work with others who have inherited a lot of deployment pipelines, you may want to consider orchestrating them actually in Azure DevOps instead. So here's a diagram just to help you all visualize this. This is basically a typical development process I showed earlier, where you work with your isolated workspace and then do the pull request to merge it into your branch that's connected to your workspace that represents the development environment. And then from there, orchestrate it with Fabric deployment pipelines. You can also orchestrate it like I said with Azure pipelines, which gives you the advantage then of being able to do approvals. Another advantage is that you can actually do a form of data ops afterwards. So you can actually use Azure pipelines to orchestrate your Fabric deployment pipeline deployment and then run a notebook in those workspaces. Release option 4, very, very similar to option 2, if I'm honest. So basically work on your dev and test stages in your own Fabric tenant. And this is aimed, by the way, for people mostly ISVs, but this could be if you've got clients or you want to deploy to other tenants, workspaces and other tenants. And then once you've done your test development and testing locally in your own tenant, run Azure pipelines to deploy to workspaces in other tenants. To be honest, the reality is this can very easily be done by adding additional parameters to the pipelines that I mentioned in option 2. These two options are very, very similar. In fact, the only difference is parameters if you want to add them. Here's a diagram to visualize how this can look. And I will do very quickly some of these demos for you now. I will do the Power BI demo first. So I've got Power BI report locally in Power BI desktop, saved as a Power BI desktop project that you've all been talking about. I'm just going to make a quick change, make a save. You don't need to squint. All you need to know is I'm making a change. And that in turn will update the files that are stored in that folder, which I've already initialized as a Git repository. Just helps some terminology here for you all. What a Git repository really is a folder or a directory, depending on your how you want to use the terminology, with a hidden .git folder. In that .git folder is a proprietary database format that does clever things to track all your changes in that particular folder. That's a very short version of what a Git repository is. This is one here. I've made some changes and I'm going to use GitHub Copilot to do my commit change for me. If you're using GitHub Copilot Business and Visual Studio Code, use this. If you're using GitHub Copilot Trial, maybe don't, because you'll use your credit up very fast. So I'm just letting GitHub Copilot generate the change I've made. I'm going to commit, and then it invites me to synchronize my change because I've set up what's known as a remote to a repository in Azure Repos. So if we go to Azure Repos and Azure DevOps, you can see it's told me I've updated feature. It invites me to do a pull request, and I want to do a pull request to dev. By the way, what I can also do here, because I've got the feature workspace in question set up with Git integration, is update that change that I did in the repository. But of course, it doesn't update the change that I've got in my dev workspace that's connected to my dev branch. So that's why you have to run this pull request. So I click create. As you can see here, it's actually starting to run a pipeline for me. That's because I've got something called a branch policy configured on my dev branch. And what this is basically saying is every time someone does a pull request to my dev branch, run a pipeline. And I can quickly show you this now. What this particular pipeline does, as you can see, it actually uses Tabular Editor CLI to run BPA behind the scenes. And then it does a similar thing with PBI Inspector. It downloads PBI Inspector and then runs its default settables to check my visuals. And then once this pull request has completed, it will merge in the changes to dev for me. I won't wait for it to finish because I want to get to the newer demos. So you can also deploy via Fabric deployment pipelines. So if we quickly go over, I won't spend too much time on this, but just be aware, you can do it in a GUI-based manner in Microsoft Fabric with deployment pipelines. These are very well documented, so I'm not going to focus on these. Just be aware they exist, folks. You can deploy this with Azure pipelines, for example, using Fabric CICD. This is just one example. There's other methods available. If you like to write and generate lots and lots of YAML syntax, you're more than welcome to do it with APIs. Fabric CICD, though, is a nice layer of abstraction. So, for example here, and I'm doing this the fast version of this demo, what you can do is in a pipeline, you need to specify which version of Python you want to use. For Fabric CICD, it needs to be versions 3.9 and 3.12. By the way, that Fabric Essentials I shared earlier, that also has a link to Fabric CICD. So you can just use that one-stop link. Then install Fabric CICD. Authenticate if you've not set up a service connection. And then you can literally run the Python script to deploy via Fabric CI/CD. There's more advanced options you can do. You can set up all your rebindings. You can do advanced parameterization in Fabric CI/CD, etc. But all I'm literally doing here for this particular demo is literally just running the YAML file stated. Well, not even the YAML file. I am just running the Python script that's stated here. That's it. So I just call that Python script and it will automatically, wrong repository, that's where you can see it. Sorry, folks. And if I click on workspace, you can see I've got a load of Fabric items in here. And I'm literally just calling this Python script with some arguments to deploy to a specific workspace. There is some advanced functionality, like I said, parameterization, etc. This is the very short version. You can also use it, of course, in YAML pipelines as well. I said earlier about the fact that the only difference between options 2 and 4 was really parameters. Well, I can actually do here. I actually have a version of the Fabric CI/CD pipeline. You can see I've got some parameters where you can enter client ID, service principal client ID, and secret value and tenant ID. So literally like this. That's the main. That's how you can go from an option 2 to an option 4 style pipeline. Now, the last pipeline demo I will show here. This is where it is workable AI. It's because there is, like I mentioned, an Azure DevOps MCP server available. Put a link to it in the chat. I've actually run this earlier because if I run this now for you all, it will take a fair few minutes and a lot of time up in this session. So as you can see, I've asked already, and I will assume it. I've asked it to list all the projects in my organization. This is all in Visual Studio Code. I'm doing this. I'm using natural language, no GUI, clicky, just asking natural language. It's given me back all of my projects in the organization. I then asked it to list all the repos in one particular project, the same project I've been working with today. And I won't zoom in here, but you can see it's giving me back a nice long list of repositories. But I don't want to view all of those. I want to filter. So I've said in natural language, as you can see here, can you list all the repos that start with Fabric CICD instead? And it's giving me back 2, as you can see here, very quickly. I then said, can you list all the YAML pipelines that have that particular repository as a source? It came back with a list. Okay, this is general list so far. Maybe not always real world scenario, you might think. But then I decided to ask this. I asked it if it can run one of the pipelines for me directly from Visual Studio Code, so no need to go into Azure DevOps. And it did. Just to show there's no smoke and mirrors, I'm going to run this command again. So it's working on it now, and hopefully it'll remember what it did earlier. And it said, I've forgotten a bit. Can you just confirm? Let's run. I'm just going to put in the right one because, yeah, after a while, it can forget what it's done. But I do want to show this because it is pretty good. So in the future, you'll be able to do things like run pipelines directly from Visual Studio Code or Claude Desktop or anywhere else that supports MCP servers using natural language. This is only the tip of the iceberg of what this MCP server is capable of, though. You can create really nice, deep wiki documentation with natural language using this. I know because I've already done it. You can create wiki pages of all your repositories, all of your pipelines. I say all your pipelines, it doesn't recognize yet classic release pipelines, but if you're using YAML pipelines or classic build pipelines, nice documentation about those. Now, if I go back in the Azure DevOps very quickly, and we go to pipelines, as you can see, it is running that pipeline. There is no smoke and mirrors there. I used only natural language to start running an Azure DevOps pipeline using that MCP server. So this is how you can use Azure DevOps MCP server in the real world. What you can also do, both with Fabric and with Azure DevOps and anything else Microsoft related, you can actually configure the Microsoft Learn MCP server in Visual Studio Code, and you can ask natural language about best practices for working with Fabric or Azure DevOps. You can even get things like you can use it to create new PowerShell commands, check your Python syntax, anything that's in Microsoft Learn. You can query with natural language if you have the Microsoft Learn MCP server configured in your tooling of choice, whether Visual Studio Code, Claude, etc., etc. 2 very real-world AI cases for you there.
That's brilliant. We had a session on how to get started with the MCP server in last week in Visual Studio Code. So this is just perfect. How does it get paid for? Are you paying for each token then?
No, using this is free. Using the GitHub Copilot depends on your license.
Yeah.
The MCP servers, though, these 2 particular ones are Microsoft hosted, so they are essentially free.
Ooh.
And the Azure DevOps one is obviously still in development. Like I mentioned, the classic release pipelines aren't there, etc. But yeah, but it's all apart from obviously, apart from the GitHub Copilot licensing, the rest of it is them free. So you do have to have that investment for GitHub Copilot, which of course you can have a free. You can get free credits now, of course, with GitHub Copilot to use. If you have GitHub Copilot Business, then you can do obviously a lot more.
Yeah.
So that's how the licensing is for these two in particular.
Yeah.
And
Brilliant.
this is why you can use them both in the, as I call it, the real world. Like I said, the fact that you can go off and use natural language to run pipelines, create nice deep wiki pages. By the way, if you're using Azure DevOps, folks, really recommend testing this for those wiki pages. It will save you a lot of work. Really does.
Brilliant.
Create your own wiki pages, list your own repos, list your pipelines and the source repos, everything you can do directly through natural language and Visual Studio Code.
Brilliant.
No need to do anything complex. No need to copy and paste all your repo details over. None of that. You can do it all automatically. And this works great with those wiki pages. I can tell you, I've done it.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, I better finish off on this session with the last section. I won't do the demos for it though, because there's lots of articles, etc. online. So lastly, we need to cover the CICD methods for data warehouses and SQL database. I will go through these quickly because the reality is you can do the same CICD deployment methods that you've done in the past for SQL Server databases, especially working with SQL database projects. Now, I didn't have it amongst my collection for the links. I'm hoping one of you can dig out that link for me about SQL database projects on Microsoft Learn. But essentially, extract directly from the SQL database and Fabric or data warehouse, create the DATPAC file, and then use that DATPAC file to deploy updates to your SQL database and Fabric or data warehouses. There's various reasons why you may want to do this instead of using, for example, deployment pipelines or Fabric CI/CD library. It could be that you've just not got Git integration implemented. Could be you've got multiple items in the same workplace. You could have multiple copies of your SQL database and Fabric. More than feasible, especially if you're testing things out. You could have, for example, dev, test, and prod databases in the same workspace. Could be you want to do deployments to another tenant. It could be because you want to keep the schema updates for those isolated. So, for example, you may want to update using Fabric CI/CD library, your report, Power BI reports and semantic models. And for example, either your data warehouses or your SQL database and Fabric at a different cadence. That this way makes it a lot easier to do. Here's a diagram to help you all visualize this, because this is two different ways to do this. If you follow the Microsoft videos, you may recognize this diagram from recently. So, two ways to perform CI/CD for SQL database and Fabric. Either traditional way of creating a database project, or you can extract the SQL, the schema, and create a DATPAC directly into Azure DevOps. Now, very quickly, I will show you how you can do this. If you've got the MS SQL extension installed, for example, and I've just moved away from there, so I've got to go back into it. And I'll zoom in here. If you right-click a database in Fabric you're connected to, you can right-click, select Create Database from Project from Database. And that will eventually bring up a nice window. Of course, I'm doing this demo in Teams, so I'm going to have a delay here. But it essentially means once you've done that, you will have this, I'll make this bigger for you all, this database project that you can synchronize then in Azure repos if you want to. So this exact project here, I actually have here already, stored as a Git repository in Fabric, and then from there I can use it in pipelines. You can do a pipeline for either of these. So for example, go here to this particular one. If I click on edit, if you've worked with SQL Server database projects in the past, this is exactly the same concept. You create a DATPAC based on your database project. So all of that text I showed you earlier. and then that will create a .pack file. So if we go back into the pipeline in question, you will see here I've had an artifact, and in there I have a .pack file, or I can extract as well. And then I can, from there, take the contents of that pack file and actually deploy it to either a SQL database in Fabric, if it's based on a SQL database in Fabric, or a Fabric data warehouse. So in this diagram here, you can replace these items directly with SQL data warehouses in Fabric, I should say, and it would be exactly the same kind of principle. So just to summarize everything, folks, Azure DevOps caters for Fabric CICD requirements. For best coverage of items, I recommend implementing Fabric Git integration. There's various release options available for your needs, and as you've realized today, I could go into more depth about all of these. This was only a 60-minute session, but I could literally talk I would say all day, but probably all week about these methods. You can modernize CI/CD practices with AI. As I've showed you just now, you can take advantage of these MCP servers now to do things directly in Azure DevOps using natural language, or to improve your experience as a developer. If you're a data engineer, for example, using the Microsoft Learn MCP server is absolutely great. And for those who are used to working with CI/CD for SQL Server, you can still use those concepts to do CI/CD for SQL database and Fabric and data warehouses. Obviously, appreciate it's a lot to take in. So with that being said, are there any questions?
There are a couple, but before we do, that is a lot to take in. I think that's definitely one to pop on YouTube that people can then revisit the different elements, because there's so many elements, but beautifully presented as always, Kevin.
Thank you very much.
It's fabulous.
So
both from UV, actually. First question from UV, and it's going back a little bit. So he just says something he's observed: if you're working in teams and want to track who is committing what in Fabric, Azure DevOps is more preferable than GitHub, since on GitHub all the codes are committed as the user who authenticated set up Git for Fabric. Is this the case, or am I not following the right steps?
Can you repeat your reply for the question in the chat so I can actually read it as well, if that's okay?
Yeah.
Just so I can.
Yeah. And whilst you're reading it, I'm just going to share the screen, because next week, I just want to draw everyone's attention. We've got Alex and Greg Phillips joining us.
Right. So just to answer that question, you can do the same with GitHub. However, I will admit, recently I did a presentation elsewhere, and it was a very full room, and only a handful of people were using GitHub, because the reality is a lot of enterprises are still using Azure DevOps. So one of the main factors really in whether you use Azure DevOps or GitHub, especially in a large enterprise, is what your enterprise is currently using. That is the reality. I'll be completely upfront with all of you about that. That's usually the main deciding factor.
Yeah. And then the other question was also, you was interested, what's your system spec? So many extensions hosted on VS Code.
Powerful enough to host those extensions is a good thing to say. I have quite a good XPS laptop, basically. I've had it a while, but it was top of the range when I bought it.
Yeah.
That's my system specs. And the good thing about working with VS Code, of course, all of these extensions are actually lightweight. So you can have a lower a laptop with not much high spec and have these extensions installed. Or you can actually look, if you're using GitHub, if you've got a GitHub account, you can look to use GitHub Codespaces instead, to be honest. So you have options. But yeah, that's the good thing about VS Code, folks. You can have a lot of extensions. They're quite lightweight. Most of them are lightweight, I should say, and they're good to go. A side tip for those of you, by the way, working with any websites, you can actually use an extension called Live Pages as well locally to view the output of your HTML. So that is how lightweight and versatile all these extensions are. And there's a whole list I can recommend for Fabric, but there you go, like Fabric, it's Studio, etc., etc.
It's just so much, isn't there?
There is. And like I said, the main factor is usually what your enterprise is using. That's the reality. A lot of places will go, we're using Azure DevOps. You need to use Azure DevOps for this. And the same goes for GitHub, of course. And even though it's obviously, there's a lot of open source solutions like GitHub, the reality is a lot of enterprises are still on Azure DevOps, especially when it's got things on there like Azure Boards. The reality is that Azure Boards has been around in different forms for around, I think, 15 years now. It's well established. And obviously, that there is still being things done, and there's tight integration with Azure Boards and Azure pipelines with GitHub. As I mentioned earlier, you can actually link to pull requests, GitHub items basically, directly from Azure Board work items and Azure Boards. You can run pipelines and Azure pipelines directly from GitHub, GitHub repositories, etc. But then I've worked on GitHub as well, so I'm quite flexible. And I see another question. Can you have a mixture of deployment pipelines, traditional SQL, and Git, Azure DevOps, or everything else? This is one for one workspace, yes, but it would be hard to maintain. I would say to ideally try and narrow it down to one particular option if it's possible. If you really need traditional SQL method, then yes, you can still do that isolated, like I mentioned just now. But I would look to use, depending on the skill sets of people that need to work with it, either Fabric deployment pipelines or a pipeline in Azure pipelines instead. All of this, a lot of stuff can be done with Fabric deployment pipelines. For more complex requirements, then use Azure pipelines, ideally with a layer of abstraction, like I said, like Fabric CICD Python library. You can also use Fabric command line interface. There's PowerShell modules available, etc. All of those can be found on that Fabric Essentials site that I showed the link for earlier, so you can look around, see what's in there, which may help yourselves, to be honest.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. That was really intensive, and I think will be extremely helpful to many people, when they come to look at it at different points. So it's a fabulous collection of different resources and knowledge for the different areas. Next week, we've got documentation as a superpower from Alexandru Badu and Greg Phillips, which is an 1.5-hour session because they're really quite in depth. So a huge thank you, Kevin, and a huge thank you to everyone else for all of the questions and the support in the chat. It makes the user group so much more interesting when we have all of your dialogue as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a fabulous evening. And Kevin, thank you very much. And we will see you next time. And for all the links, you've definitely helped us keep learning. And there's a lot. But yes.
And remember, all the links will be at the bottom of the YouTube channel as well. Once that's the YouTube video, once it's published, all the links will be in there as well.
Yeah, Anthony's brilliant. He captures them all for us on a little notepad and then sends them to me so that I add them onto the bottom of the YouTube link in the morning so that everyone can access. And yes, I'm being taught tomorrow at 2 p.m. on our YouTube channel. Yes. Right, I'm going. It's yoga time, people, and I'm going to have to miss it next week for Alex. I went 1.5 hours and he went, yes, Sue, if you want me, I want 1.5 hours. I went, okay. So no yoga for me next week. So I'm going to make the most of it this week. But have a great session. Say hi to Sandra, Kevin, and have a fabulous, fabulous evening, people. And see you all later.
Thanks all.
Thank
Bye,
you.
all.
Take care. Bye, everyone. Bye. Bye.